I'm talking about the Galileo case, and I began by describing how, before Galileo, in the ancient and medieval world, the belief was that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun went around the Earth. This is the so-called geocentric theory, and it seemed to conform to ordinary experience, which is our experience is that the sun rises and sets, not that the Earth is moving, but the sun appears to be moving. Now, Galileo was a Florentine astronomer from Florence, highly respected, and he was once a supporter of the Ptolemaic geocentric theory, which, by the way, did conform to a lot of empirical observations. But eventually Galileo became convinced that Copernicus was right and that the Earth revolved around the sun. This is the so-called heliocentric alternative. Copernicus, by the way, had advanced his theory about half a century earlier, in 1543, in fact, in a book dedicated to the Pope. And Copernicus said, look, I don't have any physical proof. I mean, remember, this is a time when you couldn't, go in a spaceship and see the Earth going around the sun. So Copernicus goes, I don't have any direct proof, but the power of this heliocentric theory is that it produces better predictions of planetary orbits. In other words, if we assume that the sun is at the center, the Earth goes around, we'll be able to calculate more accurately the orbits of planets. Now, this created a big debate in the religious and scientific community, which, by the way, at the time was kind of the same thing. In other words, it was clergymen who were doing science. The scientists who were operating at the time were mostly affiliated in some way with the clergy, if they were not priests or bishops themselves. And So there was a debate over the Copernican theory, but interestingly, Copernicus didn't really get in any trouble over his theory. And the general view was that, look, Copernicus is onto something very interesting, very important, very useful for calculating the motions of heavenly bodies, but not sort of definitive or persuasive enough to sort of throw out the geocentric theory altogether. Now, Galileo comes in, and he makes some contributions to the Copernican theory. He advances the debate further in support of the heliocentric hypothesis, let's call it. But Galileo's arguments, again, are valid, but not by themselves decisive. In fact, a couple of his key arguments, as we'll see, were also mistaken. And today there's a mythology around all this, so we have to sort of remove the mythological aspects to what Galileo actually did. One of the mythologies is that, Galileo went to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He dropped heavy and light objects to the ground, large objects, small objects, and he noticed that, hey, all the objects, whether large or small, whether more massive or less massive, nevertheless hit the ground at the same time. And this is sometimes told today to say, well, one simple experiment sort of refuted centuries of medieval theorizing. Well, except that this is not even true. Galileo didn't do that. One of his students conducted an experiment in which the student dropped heavy, more massive and less massive objects. And guess what? The more massive objects hit the ground first, which you and I can verify by doing it ourselves. If you go up to the top of a tall building, take a more massive and a less massive object and toss them both off, you'll notice the more massive object hits the ground first. Why? Well, basically, it's because of air resistance. In other words, air resistance gets in the way of being able to do a perfect experiment. What Galileo was getting at is that more massive and less massive objects will, in the absence of air resistance. In other words, if you drop a more massive and less massive object in a vacuum, then yes, they will hit the ground at the same time. But Galileo didn't come to this conclusion based upon experiments performed at the Tower of Pisa or anywhere else. He did it on the basis of some rather complex deductive reasoning that we don't need to go into here. But here's Thomas Kuhn, the historian of science. He goes, to verify Galileo's law by observation demands special equipment. In other words, you have to create a vacuum. Galileo himself got the law not by observation, but by a chain of logical arguments. Now, Galileo developed a more sophisticated telescope, and people were able for the first time to see farther and see more clearly. He made some important new observations about the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, spots on the sun, and all of this sort of undermined the Ptolemaic theory and supported the heliocentric theory. But as I will point out in the next segment, all of this was interesting and it tipped the balance toward the heliocentric theory, but it didn't settle the issue.